Good morning and welcome to the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings Masterclass with a focus on Europe. We're going to be starting shortly, but in the meantime, if you just hold on and relax, and we'll wait for a few more people to join us. We should start just after 9:30 London, 10:30 Central Europe. So good morning and welcome to the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings Masterclass for Europe. We're going to be starting in a few seconds' time. I'm delighted to be here with you in this what is very hot weather for the United Kingdom. And I'm delighted also to be joined by my colleagues Elizabeth Shepherd, who is the Managing Director for our consultancy team, and Mark Tweddle, who is our Senior Higher Education Consultant. My name's Duncan Ross, and I'm the Chief Data Officer for Times Higher Education. So today we hope to take you through an outline of the impact ranking methodology. So a guide to what that methodology looks like and how we've generated the results. Then Elizabeth and Mark are going to actually take us through some of the outcomes from that from a European perspective. Where is Europe strong? Where does Europe perhaps have some opportunities to improve its performance? And then finally, at the end of this session, I'm going to try and explore to see if the information we have around the Sustainable Development Goals could actually give us an insight as well into how well universities are set up to address crises such as the COVID-19 crisis, which is sweeping through the world. Now, some practicalities about today's session. We do have a lot of people on the call, so as a result, we will be keeping people on mute throughout the call. If your personal connection is slow, one thing we've found is that quite often with Zoom, particularly if you switch off your own video, that can significantly improve the performance of the system. We do, although we're keeping you on mute, we do want to make this a session where you can ask questions. To do so, please use the Q&A functionality that you'll find within Zoom. And then we'll have two opportunities to answer the questions. At the end of the section on methodology, we will have somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes when I will take questions. And then at the end of the overall session, we will have additional time there. And hopefully we'll be able to address all of your questions then. If there are some that are left over, then we will try and write those up and get that around to you later on. If you have any further questions, please do contact Nicholas Kletz, our Regional Director, and I'll give you his email at the end of the session. And then two final things. We will share all of the presentation slides with you after the presentation, and we're also recording this masterclass session. So with that, thank you very much for coming along. Welcome to the masterclass. The starting point, of course, is around our methodology. What is our methodology for the impact rankings? How have we got there? What are we trying to demonstrate? And to help us understand this, the starting point actually is, why is Times Higher Education undertaking this in the first place? Well, our particular goals, firstly, are to help universities to understand their position against their mission. Secondly, to help students access and find the university that is best suited not just to their abilities, but also very much to their aspirations. but above all to help higher education deliver transformational teaching, research and innovation. And from a data perspective, we collect data on these three distinct missions: teaching, research and impact, through the rankings that we do. That enables us to capture data from universities as well as generating the rankings themselves. Our first ranking, the World University Ranking, was created initially in 2004, and it has a focus very much on research-intensive universities. To participate in the World University Rankings, an institution needs to publish at least 1,000 academic publications over a 5-year period, as recorded in Elsevier's Scopus dataset. More recently, we've started to explore the teaching mission. And at the moment, we have 2 teaching rankings, the WSJ THE College Rankings in the United States and the Japan University Rankings in Japan. And those are very much based around how students engage with their learning experience. But we realised that we were also missing this significant element of university activity, which is their direct impact on the world. And so 2 years ago, we created our first ever University Impact Rankings. And the core of the Impact Rankings is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This idea that for the world to survive, it needs to develop sustainably, and that there needs to be a consistent framework which not only deals with traditional green issues, but also deals with issues of inequality and also of fair and equitable development. And so the impact rankings are based very much on the UN SDGs. Now, the SDGs are a fantastic tool for understanding Agenda 2030 and how the world needs to progress in order to be sustainable. The challenge, of course, for Times Higher Education, and indeed for universities, is that they aren't focused on higher education. They, in fact, have a goal for every part of society. But as a result, we've had to think very carefully about how we can ensure that the goals can be linked to activities that a university might undertake. And so we've built out a theory of change to inform our decision about what to measure for universities. And our theory of change has 4 significant elements. The first is around research. Clearly, the research that a university does can be crucial in terms of driving towards the Sustainable Development Goals. If your university is doing research into battery technology, for example, that will have a clear and direct impact on SDG 7, clean and affordable energy, and SDG 13, climate action. So research is the first part of the theory of change. The second is stewardship. Universities are stewards, they are custodians of significant resources, both the physical resources of your campus and your buildings and your grounds, but also, very importantly, the human resources of your faculty, your employees, and of course your students. The third aspect is the outreach that universities do. Universities have always worked in their communities and regionally and nationally and indeed internationally. Often this work hasn't been fully appreciated, but that outreach again can be vital in moving the world towards a sustainable future. And the final aspect is teaching. Not just how you can produce the graduates of the future who have the necessary skills for sustainability, but also how you can more generally encourage a sustainable perspective from all of your alumni. So when we've created our metrics for each SDG, we've tried to make sure that they link to these 4 principles. For example, when we look at SDG 2, we look at the research that the university is undertaking around hunger. In terms of stewardship, we try to ensure that the university is taking action to ensure that all students can participate and are not prevented by issues associated with hunger. In terms of outreach, we look at what your university is doing in its community to address issues of hunger. And finally, in terms of teaching, we look at the percentage of your graduates who have a degree in agriculture or aquaculture with sustainability built into the coursework. Now, the way we've built up the ranking is to take each of the 17 SDGs and create an individual ranking associated with that. The United Nations itself has created 169 indicators that sit below the SDGs and 223 unique targets. For our part, we've created 17 SDGs, or matched the 17 SDGs, and we've identified 105 different things that we can potentially measure, and 220 measurements as part of that. And at the end of that process, we went through each of those measurements and each of those metrics to make sure that we could link those conceptually to the goals of the SDGs. Now, in building out the metrics, we also had to think very carefully about how to do this in as equitable fashion as possible. And the first concern was around ease of participation. I just mentioned 105 metrics and 220 measurements. That seems like a huge amount of work, and indeed it is. But as part of our approach, we decided that participation would not require a university to submit data for every single SDG. There were two reasons for that. The first one, well, three reasons actually. The first one was to recognise the significant amount of work that would be required from universities. The second one was to make sure that we weren't biasing this ranking in favour of universities that have strong data infrastructures already built out, because we know that that would have meant that the ranking was biased significantly towards Western Europe, Australia and North America. If this ranking is about sustainability and we weren't able to see universities from sub-Saharan Africa or from Latin America or from the poor parts of Asia participating, then the ranking would be failing. The third reason was that we suspected that universities in different parts of the world would have very different focuses, and we wanted to allow universities to submit data for the SDGs that were most relevant to them in their context. Why would a university in Berlin have the same focus as a university in Kuala Lumpur or a university in Brazil or a university in China? We would expect to see differences. Now, we've also spent a lot of time trying to think carefully about the metrics, trying to ensure that they are fair and that they make sense in all parts of the world. And for some of the metrics, we've taken a different approach than we would in the World University Rankings. In the World University Rankings, for example, we try and balance by size to ensure that large universities, or small universities for that matter, don't have an advantage. But in this particular ranking, there are some metrics that we've chosen that we know will give additional support where need is greatest. For example, when we look at first-generation students, universities in Europe have a harder time getting first-generation students because more families in Europe have been through higher education. If you look at a university in sub-Saharan Africa, there may be a greater pool of potential candidates for them to access. We think that's actually fair. We think that that actually gives a balancing aspect to combat the other advantages that universities from higher income countries have. Also, throughout this process, we've tried to think very carefully and listen to input from universities. And if you have input that you'd like to share with us, we would love to hear it. We want to make the metrics better and more relevant as time goes by. So let's think about a couple of the ways that we're assessing performance. Firstly, in terms of research, we do have a research element, although it is far smaller than it is in the World University Rankings. In the impact rankings, our partners, Elsevier, have worked not just by themselves, but also in conjunction with the Aurora network and with individual universities, to create a basket of keywords that identify publications within a particular SDG. And once we have that keyword search, we can then look at the publications that those keywords identify and apply measurements on top of them, such as the number of publications from a university or the citation performance. So that's how we've approached research. But also in this particular ranking, we have for the first time looked at direct evidence of activities. For example, when we look at SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, we have a section here called water in the community. Now, water in the community asks universities to supply evidence of actions that they are taking. One of them, for example, is around cooperation on water security. And the question is, does your university as a body cooperate with local, national or global governments on water security? And here what we want universities to do is firstly tell us if they're doing this, but secondly provide a piece of evidence that demonstrates that. Now obviously this brings us into the realm of qualitative assessment. And we've tried to do this in a way that simplifies the process and also makes it as fair and equitable as possible. And the first thing I'll say here obviously is that we don't expect this evidence to be in English necessarily. If the evidence is in an appropriate language, then that makes perfect sense, and it's our job to make sure that we have people on our team who can read and interpret that evidence correctly, and we bring people in to make sure we can do that. So how would we assess this evidence? Well, the first thing to say is we like that evidence to be public, and we like it to be, if possible, visible outside your university. So here's a good example of a piece of evidence around water security. In this case, it has come from the University of Waterloo in Canada. And the question, remember, was what work is your university doing to work with governments, whether they're local, regional or national, around the issue of water security? And here we can see on the University of Waterloo website that they have been participating in the UN HLPF, the High Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, specifically around this issue of water security. So this is a very credible piece of evidence that they've supplied. So how do we formally assess that evidence? Well, here we go. Firstly, if a university tells us that they do something, we will give them credit for that. We believe that universities are trying to tell us the truth. So if you say you're doing something, we will give you a score for that. But then we will look at the evidence that's been supplied. And we do a relatively simple assessment. Firstly, we say, does it actually match the question? Is this evidence a direct and specific link to the question that's been asked? And if it is, we'll give you a full point for it. If we think there is a link, but it is more general, we will give you half a point. And clearly, if it's not relevant to the question, you won't score for it. But if it is relevant, we will then further assess whether the evidence is public. This public nature of evidence is quite important to us because, firstly, it gives us greater confidence that the university is genuinely committed to this course of action. But also it means that the university is holding itself accountable more broadly to the general public. And we think that's a very important thing. If you believe in something and you're demonstrating that to your public can challenge you on that. And that is a very, very positive thing for universities to be doing. In some occasions, we may also ask for additional details. So, for example, if we were asking around a policy document, we'd be looking for date evidence. Has the policy been either created or reviewed within the last 5 years? Because up-to-date policies and policies that have been reviewed are much more likely to be a living document and enacted in an institution. Now, we've talked about each of the 17 individual rankings, but of course we also pull them together into a single overall score and an overall ranking. The way we do this is we take your score from SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals. This is a sort of meta SDG. It talks about cooperation, working with other bodies. So we take the score for that, and that accounts for 22% of the overall score. And then we will take the 3 other SDGs in which your university performs most strongly. This does mean you have a choice. If you wish to submit to more than the minimum number of SDGs, then you're extending your opportunity to score highly. You may score more highly in an SDG than you think you're going to. So it does give you some decisions that you can make around that. The way we've created the scoring process ensures that the research component, the bibliometrics, is always the same proportion regardless of which SDGs you choose to submit data to. Now, before we open to questions, just a little bit of feedback on the data that we received last year and a few changes that are going into the methodology for next year. And the first thing to say is that the quality of evidence that universities are providing is exceptionally strong. We don't require you to produce every piece of evidence. We ask you to produce a single piece of evidence for each question, which shows what your university is typically doing. And yet we see universities are actually going out of the way to find really thought-leading examples of work that they're doing. We did, however, notice that there were a couple of areas where universities were finding it difficult to provide data in a consistent way. And so we've tried to make those questions more straightforward and easier for universities to answer, particularly looking at SDG 2, where we look at food waste, and SDG 6, where we look at the amount of water used on campus. Throughout the process, we have gone through and tried to make the guidance that we're providing clearer. And this is one of the areas where we truly appreciate the feedback we get from universities. We've obviously written our questions with a particular perspective. We come from particular backgrounds. And so it's really useful when universities get in touch with us and explain if a particular question doesn't work in their context. That enables us to either change the question or change the guidance to ensure that more universities who are in the same context can actually understand what we're trying to achieve. We're also looking at extending questions in SDG 13, where last year for the first time we asked about carbon neutrality. This year we'll ask in a little more detail about the difference between approaches to Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 of carbon neutrality. And finally, and again I hope in an attempt to make things clearer, we'll look at expanding and clarifying how we're asking universities to report on their progress against the SDGs in SDG 17. So with that, in a few minutes we're going to go and look at the country ranking results, but hopefully before that we've got an opportunity to actually take some of your questions. So Persephone, do we have any questions?
We have one question, and it is if the evidence requested is going to change every year.
So no, it isn't necessarily. Now, obviously, we're looking for activities that took place within a particular time period. So in that sense, the evidence may change. It may be that, for example, your evidence from last year is no longer in the time frame we're looking at. But it is possible to submit the same evidence if you think that is still relevant to the question and relevant to the work you're doing. Okay, so you can keep the same evidence. That's particularly true when it comes to policies, obviously. Policies don't necessarily change very quickly, at least they probably shouldn't, unless the policy has a major problem. So yes, the evidence can be the same. We hope also that the data submission portal, we've made some significant changes to that. We hope that that's also going to make it easier for universities to reuse data that they've submitted before, reuse evidence if that is appropriate.
And we have one more question by Thomas Parrott, which is, will there be any changes to the Elsevier keywords this year? When will this be published?
So I am continuing to talk to Elsevier about this. There were some fairly significant changes between year 1 and year 2 in terms of their keywords. And that is an ongoing process. There is continually a balance when we take a keyword search approach between false positives and false negatives, so between type 1 and type 2 errors. Fundamentally, you can never be perfect. What you have to do is get to a compromise where you minimize the false positives, so publications that shouldn't be in the dataset that are included, and of course false negatives, where we exclude publications that should be included. Now, as part of this, there is now a mechanism for universities to directly participate in that process. So, and I will look up the link and share it either through the chat whilst Mark and Elizabeth are talking about the results, or alternatively at the end of the session. But essentially what this approach allows you to do is either to comment on how a particular paper that Elsevier present to you does or doesn't reflect a specific SDG, or alternatively to upload a paper or a reference to a paper that you think is a good example of research towards a particular SDG. So both work to help them refine their keyword approach. But those keywords are open, they are available on Mendeley, and again I'll put a link for that hopefully into the chat in a few minutes' time.
Another question by Mr. Matt Singleton. Does submitting to a greater number of SDGs result in a higher overall ranking, or are the best 4 SDGs always used?
So the best SDGs that you score on will always be used. And by the way, I love this question because there is a huge data science correlation and causation issue around this. It turns out that the universities that are at the very top of the ranking tend to have submitted to many of the SDGs rather than the minimum number. But it's not straightforward to assume that they've scored highest because they've submitted to more. They could be scoring highest because they are more committed to this, to the sustainable agenda. So it's very difficult to be precise about that. However, what we have seen is some situations where universities have felt they are not particularly strong in an SDG, only to find out that compared to other universities, they're actually doing much better than they expect. And so that SDG ends up being selected as one of their 3 best. So generally speaking, I would suggest that if you can submit to more SDGs, it gives you more opportunities. But I'd also suggest there's another good reason for submitting to more SDGs, which is nothing to do with the rankings and really is everything to do with you demonstrating your commitment and your intention around sustainability in areas, because what we hope universities are able to do in the longer term is not just look at the ones where they're doing well, but also think very importantly about how can they transform their university in areas where perhaps they're not doing as strongly as they might like.
A few questions from Adam. You have used general site score in many SDGs. Did you consider this metric is optimal given the metrics type and responsible use of metrics?
So what we were trying to do there is we have typically 3, sometimes 2, but typically 3 research metric scores based on the publications. Usually there is a balance between ones around citations and a volume measure. Now that was designed because what we wanted to make sure is that there was some credit for actually doing more work in a particular area, because obviously when you get into very small data sets, you can have a few outlying papers. Now, why FWCI and site score? And I accept that site score is not a perfect metric. I would argue neither is field weighted citation impact. But what they're trying to do is 2 slightly different things. What site score is trying to do is to get an indication of the percentage or the number of papers that are outstanding. What field-weighted citation impact is trying to do is a bit different. It's trying to look at what the typical publication looks like. And so we were trying to get this balance between excellence and average performance. Now, I would say that as with all of the metrics, we keep these under review, and it's by no means certain we will keep on with FWCI in its current state, or indeed site score in its current state. But at the moment, we think they give a reasonable balance, also bearing in mind that they are relatively lowly weighted compared to the relative weights of citations, for example, in the World University Rankings. So we are aware of some of the concerns about this. I think there is always a challenge with bibliometrics that there are no perfect measures, but we will continue to investigate this area.
When you score universities using the research metrics, do you weight based on volume versus proportion in top 10%, etc.?
So as I just said, yes, there is one measure that is a volume-based measure, so the number of publications. And that is designed specifically to counterbalance situations where you have a university that may only have 2 or 3 papers. They're doing very well, but actually the amount of research they're doing is much more limited.
And using field-weighted citation impact for small sample sets is usually not robust and can lead to very sporadic results. Was this considered? And again, why was it still selected?
So yes, it was considered. The reason we've still chosen to use it is because it is as close to as we can get to something that gives us a fair evaluation, given that even within a particular SDG, there will be typically multiple very different subject areas with very different performance criteria in those subjects. So if you take, for example, even areas such as SDG 3, which is probably the most focused SDG because it looks at health and well-being. It's not just looking at clinical and medical papers, it's also looking at humanities papers around the impact of health on society. So even there, you can't simply say, let's look just within a single subject or treat it as a single subject. So yes, there are big challenges around the low volumes of publications, particularly in some SDGs. I think this is, however, interesting and reflective on whether or not universities are doing sufficient research in those areas. Are there opportunities for universities to expand the amount of work that they are doing around some of the SDGs? So I take your point on board, fully accept it. And if we can develop better measures, we will certainly do so in the future.
And one more question is there any sort of higher ranking given to where and how broadly policy has been affected? For example, if research affects policy in multiple countries.
So I wish there was. The challenge, and some people in the bibliometric sphere are starting to explore this, trying to look at where government white papers or green papers, for example, refer to research. But it is very, very inconsistent from country to country. The practices of civil services in different countries are very different. And so it's particularly difficult to do that in a way that is genuinely appropriate and fair. We have tried to address that to a degree when we look at asking about cooperation between universities and governments. So where we're asking that, a good piece of evidence, for example, might be if there is a white paper, if there is a green paper, or even better, legislation that refers to the work done by your university, then that would be a brilliant piece of evidence of that link. But in a more general sense, as I say, I wish there was that data so that we could actually dig into that more deeply. A long-term goal of this should clearly be moving away from metrics that look at outputs and towards metrics that look at outcomes. But this is a very, very challenging area of measurement. As I say, as we can move in that direction, we will, but I suspect that's several years away at the moment.
Do you wait for size of university? Example, for the size, the impact of a smaller university may be huge.
So there are some metrics which are weighted by size. So, for example, when we look at your water usage, for example, or your energy usage, those are clearly weighted by size because we don't want to bias, in that case, against large institutions. There are some metrics such as field-weighted citation impact, which are again size independent, but there are others where size is important. So there is a balance there. We hope we've struck the right balance, but we accept that in some situations we may not have got that quite right. Again, please do talk to us in detail about this. If there are specific questions where you think we could do a better job, we'd love to hear from you about that.
And the last one is SDG 17 is central in this ranking. Can you elaborate a bit on its measurement? And the slide says something about teaching. How does that fit in?
So we chose to make SDG 17 a mandatory one because its focus is around partnership and cooperation. And one of the things that is clear about the Sustainable Development Goals, firstly, is that they work together in very important ways. It's very hard to extract a single goal, which is why we've tried to look at all 17. But the other one is the importance of cooperation across both multiple universities, but also across different sectors. So in SDG 17, we've tried to address that. We've also tried to identify how universities are directly measuring their progress against the SDGs. So that's an important aspect. But we've also cheated slightly. So if we look at SDG 4, quality education, in the UN documentation, there is this important element 4.7, which talks about education for sustainability. We've chosen to take that and put that into 17 because that's our mandatory SDG. And so there we ask a question about the degree to which a university is building sustainability into its educational programs. Now, I do think there's more work to be done about that. Of all the 4 aspects of our theory of change, teaching is the hardest one to evaluate and evaluate consistently. Now, there are some excellent resources out there, by the way. If you're looking to understand how students, or indeed faculty, or anyone across your university understands sustainability at the moment, there is a free program done by the United Nations called SULI test, which is a sustainable literacy test. And you can register for that, and that's a fantastic program that's well worth looking at. But this is an area that I think deserves further exploration in the future. Now, we're going to stop here, and I'm going to hand over to my colleagues Elizabeth and Mark, but there is another opportunity for questions at the end of this session. So please, if you have further questions, do ask them via the Q&A process. So over to Mark.
Thank you very much, Duncan, and good morning to everyone joining us. In this section, I'll be providing an overview of results from a selection of the SDGs, and I'll be doing that at a fairly high level. And for one of those SDGs, I'll hand over to my colleague Elizabeth, who will take a more in-depth look at one of those SDGs. So probably a good place for us to start is with the overall impact ranking. And as Duncan mentioned earlier, an overall score is created from SDG 17, plus the 3 top scoring SDGs of any institution. Across the world, there were 768 universities who qualified for entry into the overall impact rankings. Europe is represented by 234 universities from 32 countries or territories, which represents a significant expansion up from 152 universities in the inaugural overall impact ranking in 2019. Top ranked in the world was the University of Auckland, and that's the second year running they finished top of the overall impact ranking. So despite there being some changes in the methodology year on year, most notably the expansion to include the full suite of 17 SDGs this time, there is still an element of consistency in the ranking. And top ranked from Europe in 6th position was the University of Bologna. And if we just look at the geographic distribution of the top 100 of the impact rankings, shown in the blue circles, and compare that to the top 100 of the world university rankings in the red circles, we do broadly see a greater level of geographic diversity in the overall impact rankings. Most notably, it's less concentrated in North America. And I think this relatively greater level of geographic spread is an indication of what Duncan spoke about earlier regarding equity, and is an indication that universities of varying sizes and specialisms and in different parts of the world can participate in these rankings and indeed do very well in them. I'll now move on to talk about individual SDGs, starting with SDG 1, no poverty. This is one of the SDGs newly included in our rankings this year. So we had 373 universities across the world submit data for this one, 77 from Europe. And we will see in a later section to be presented by Duncan that this SDG is one in which European universities were less likely to participate in relative to the global average. However, despite that relatively low level of participation, we do see a very strong performance from European universities in this SDG. So whilst first place in the world was taken by Arizona State University, not far behind was the University of Bologna in 4th position. And we also see a really strong performance from the likes of University College Cork, Aix-Marseille University, and the University of Leeds making the top 10. In total, there were 12 European universities making the top 50. And what this SDG is looking at, in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see the scores achieved by University of Bologna across the 4 key measures here. We look at universities' contributions to research on poverty and poverty-related issues. That, as Duncan mentioned earlier, is looking at number of publications, the field-weighted citation impact. But also for this SDG, it looks at the levels of co-authorship with researchers in lower and lower middle-income countries. We also measure the proportion of students receiving financial aid because of poverty. And then there are 2 evidence-based measures. Firstly, looking at the anti-poverty programs in place at the university. So are universities providing support specifically to students from low-income households to help them complete their studies? And we have another evidence-based measure, one in which University of Bologna picks up maximum scoring, which looks at the anti-poverty programs in place in the wider community. So for example, are universities assisting in the startup of local sustainable businesses, perhaps through providing mentorship or access to university facilities? Moving on to SDG 3, good health and well-being. This is quite an interesting one to look at, and it's one of the most competitive SDGs in terms of the levels of participation. And that's perhaps unsurprising given that so many universities have medical schools and university-linked hospitals. We can see that there were 182 European universities submitting data for this one. And top ranked in the world was the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, this being one of 3 SDGs in which a European university came top. And next highest rank from Europe was the University of Dundee, coming in 9th position. But they weren't the only European universities to perform well in this SDG. A total of 15 came in the top 50. And again, if we just look at what this SDG is measuring, like all SDGs, there is a research component. And as Duncan alluded to earlier, identifying the key words for this SDG is perhaps a little bit easier compared to some of the other SDGs. The keywords in this case including the names of particular human diseases, viruses, or conditions. The second metric, one in which RCSI understandably scores very well in, this assesses how universities are contributing to the education of future health professionals by looking at the proportion of graduates who receive a degree associated with a healthcare profession. And finally, this SDG includes an evidence-based measure, which touches on the outreach and stewardship elements of the theory of change. It includes asking universities to evidence whether they deliver outreach programs in the local community to improve and promote health and well-being, as well as whether universities make available their sports facilities to the wider community, and also whether universities have a smoke-free policy. And if we now consider SDG 4, this is another competitive SDG, even more so than the one we just looked at. And I won't say too much about this SDG here, as this is the one where I'll very soon be handing over to Elizabeth to take a more in-depth look. But broadly, this SDG is looking at how universities support early years learning as well as lifelong learning. So essentially the role of the university as an educator beyond just its own students. And in terms of results, we see a really strong performance from European universities here. Top ranked in the world was Aalborg University, followed closely behind in 4th by the University of L'Aquila. And European universities were very well represented in the top 50, a total of 16 European universities shown on screen here, including University of A Coruña and University of Cumbria making the top 10. And at that, I'll hand over to Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Mark, and indeed Duncan, for that excellent insight into the methodology and how Duncan came to design the impact ranking. So, SDG 4, a deep dive. I think the really strong results that Mark's just given us a brief insight into show the importance of this across the EU. Participation in early childhood education increased steadily from 2003, where it was across the region estimated to be approximately 84%, to over 94% in 2016, the first year of the Sustainable Development Goals that were introduced in 2015. But this has stagnated around the 94.8%, very, very close to the goal, the 2020 benchmark that was set around 95%. Reports from the EU and the United Nations suggest this is in part due to persistent cross-country variation in early childhood education across the region. No surprise with such a diverse set of countries. EU countries with the lowest participation in early childhood education include Croatia, Lithuania, Greece, and Slovenia, and the highest participation are countries that include Spain, Malta, Romania, and Bulgaria. Stressing, I think, the importance of universities throughout the region, and indeed what we're measuring here with SDG 4. So I'm going to ask Mark to go to the first slide. Over the next 5 slides, we're going to take a deep dive looking specifically at the metrics that Duncan described. So if you remember the 17 SDGs that relate directly to the UN SDGs, and then the 169 metrics and 223 indicators. So they're obviously spread across the 17 SDGs. And here we're going to focus specifically on SDG 4. Our deep dive is going to focus on the Aalborg University, the highest performing university, not only in Europe region, but overall, ranked first. And we're going to compare the performance of that university to European institutions in SDG 4 that feature in the top 30. Now, just for clarity and to ensure that everybody can understand the data that we're looking at, the comparative analysis that we're going to explore is displayed on a box and whiskers plot. I'm sure this is very familiar way of displaying data to everybody that's on the call, but just to explain so that it is clear, the box and its whiskers represent the global distribution of all of the 677 universities that participated in SDG 4. The lines to the left and right of the box represent the upper and lower quartiles, the central, the box itself, the interquartile range, and the central line, the median line, showing the central point in the distribution of that data. Now, the black dot that you can see on the screen represents Aalborg University. So that represents our central comparator institution. And as we can see, it is obviously the highest performing institution within our comparator group. The others, the white dots circled in red, represent each of the comparator institutions. Now, this is a static image. And unfortunately, the limitations of these PowerPoint slides mean that we can't hover over that and see the details of each of these institutions. Internet connections pending. I know that Duncan wants to give a live demonstration of that tool. So he will show the incredible functionality of the data tool that is accessible to all participating institutions. So with that, I'll ask Mark if he can switch to the next slide. So SDG 4 is measured by 4 metrics. We're going to take a deep dive into each of these 4 metrics one by one. But as we can see, this bringing to life the theory of change that Duncan referred to, that was underpinned the design of the impact ranking. So research, teaching, stewardship, and outreach. And each of our metrics here relating to each one of those important elements of the work of institutions. So with that, I'll ask Mark if we can go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So we had some really, really in-depth questions about the research metrics in the first Q&A. And as Duncan said, there will be another Q&A at the end. So get those questions in the Q&A box, and Persephone will ensure that we get through them all at the end of the session. Really interesting questions about the varied research metrics and why they're included and what they mean and how that sort of relates to the research work of an institution. So the 3 metrics, research metrics, are included particularly for SDG 4, and as Duncan said, they do vary across each SDG. The first research metric is described as paper views. So this measures the proportion of a university's research papers that are viewed or downloaded. So this is a very practical measure, very practical in its nature. The second is site score. So this measures the proportion of a university's research output relating to SDG 4 that is featured in the top 10% of journals as measured by site score. And the final measure is publications. And this final research metric here looks at scale, so the volume of research output, again relating to quality education, SDG 4. I want to just note one thing here, and this is the first indicator that we can see here, paper views. Our highest scoring university globally of the 677 participating institution comes last in our comparator group. So it's really, really interesting when we look at that particular indicator. The other institutions within this comparison group are far more high performing than Aalborg University, who was ranked number 1. And with that, I'll ask Mark to go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So the second metric is only measured by 1 indicator. And here we measure the proportion of graduates who gained a qualification that entitled them to teach at primary level within that country. So this again is relating directly back to SDG 4, thinking specifically about the contribution universities make to early years education. And our comparator institution, Aalborg University, comes really, really at the top of this particular metric, scoring 100 points. And with that, I'll ask Mark if we can go to the next measure. So the next metric number 3 for SDG 4, this is where we ask universities to demonstrate their actions related to local global health and well-being. So this is where we ask for the evidence to be provided. If you'll remember, Duncan was explaining how that evidence is gathered and then evaluated with those 3 particular points that can be assigned based on the quality of the evidence. So it's a qualitative assessment. Just very, very briefly to run through what each of these measures are. The first asks universities to demonstrate if they provide access to educational resources to those not studying at the university. The second, if universities host events that are open to the general public. The third, if universities host events that are open to the general public that focus specifically on vocational training and education. The fourth, if they undertake educational outreach activities beyond the campus. And the fifth, if they have a policy, a specific policy that ensures access to these activities are accessible to everybody, regardless of ethnicity, religion, disability or gender. And I'm going to ask Mark to go to the next slide at this point, because here I wanted to show you an example of exactly this type of evidence. So here we have Brunel University from right here in London, who were ranked in the 101 to 200 band for SDG 4. And what we have on the screen in front of us is the evidence that they provided. So they responded to the question, answering yes or no, but yes, that they did have a policy, and then they provided a link to this policy. I'd like to highlight 2 things. Obviously that this is publicly available information. It's on their website, so it was very, very easy for us to access and see. And as you can hopefully see, the dates that have been provided, the relevance of this strategy is put in place in the academic year 2020 to 2021 to 24 to 25. And I'll ask Mark to go to the final slide now, and we can look at the 4th and final metric that comprises SDG 4. And here we ask universities to provide evidence of the number of students starting a first bachelor's degree who identify as being the first person in their immediate family to attend university. As we can see, our comparator institution, Aalborg University, score really, really highly here. And there's a really interesting distribution of those very high performing institutions. If we remember, they're all in the top 30 of SDG 4. And it's with that, I'll say that it's incredibly interesting to do this kind of comparative analysis to show even the highest performing institutions can learn a lot from their neighbours, from their regional colleagues by looking at the data. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll now just pick up with 3 more SDGs, starting with SDG 9, Industry, Innovation and Infrastructure. This again is another quite competitive SDG in terms of the levels of participation. Top ranked in the world was the University of Tokyo and University of Toronto, sharing top place. And top ranked from Europe was TU Delft, coming in joint 3rd position. There were 3 other European universities joining TU Delft in the top 10, and a total of 15 making the top 50. And this SDG is measuring universities' research contributions on things like industrial growth, innovation, and digital infrastructure. We also look at the number of patents citing research by the university, as well as the number of university or spin-offs, which come about directly from the research carried out by the university. And those spin-offs would need to have been set up in the last 3 years and still be active at the time of data submission. And the final measure that we use here looks at research industry from research income from industry, which is actually the same measure we use in the World University Rankings when we're trying to get a gauge of knowledge transfer. So moving from an SDG related to industry to one which focuses on consumption. For SDG 12, we are exploring how universities are working towards an efficient use of resources and the minimisation of waste. And top ranked in the world for this one was the University of New South Wales. Top ranked from Europe was Aalto University, coming in 2nd position. But as you can see from that small table there, 8 of the top 10 are taken by European institutions. So an incredibly strong performance for this SDG. And what we're measuring here is certainly a research component on related issues, but we also look at the operational measures in place at the university, such as having policies on the disposal of hazardous materials, as well as policies to reduce the amount of waste sent to landfill. And just to share another evidence example, this one submitted by the University of Waterloo, they have a series of pages on its website setting out its waste policies and the targets it has set itself. So this evidence is public and also quite nicely here visibly linked to the SDGs by using those UN SDG icons. Two other measures we use for this SDG, we're looking at the proportion of waste that is recycled by a university, as well as whether universities publish a sustainability report. And so for that final measure, as well as getting an extra point if that report is public, universities will also get an extra point if it is an annual report, so extra points based on the frequency of its publication. And finally from me, just jumping ahead to SDG 16, we had 454 universities submit data for this one, 121 from Europe. Top ranked in the world was American University in Washington DC. And top ranked from Europe was the University of Bologna in third position. But like SDG 12, there is a strong representation in the top 10 from European universities, including Pompeu Fabra and SOAS University of London coming in joint fifth. What we're looking at for this SDG is research on related things like conflict, crime, law, and human rights. We also look at the governance measures in place at the university. So do they have elected representation on the university's highest governing bodies, as well as policies to support academic freedom? We also look at universities' participation in local, regional, and national governments, so providing expert advice on committees, as well as the proportion of graduates in law and civil enforcement. And I started this section with a map to highlight the relative geographic diversity of the overall impact rankings. But I thought I'd just show this one here to show somewhat the opposite. Here we see the top 100 is quite concentrated in Europe, with 59 of the top 100 coming from European universities. And that provides quite a nice little segue into Duncan's next section, which will first look at some regional and global comparisons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark and Elizabeth. So it's always interesting to see some of the detail, but let's step back a little bit. One of the things I said when I talked about this idea of how we had tried to make this ranking fair to universities from across the world was this idea of allowing universities to submit to SDG 17 and any three other SDGs. And if you remember, the third goal I said was to allow universities to focus on what was important to them in their context. And of course, what that does enable me to do is to look at that distribution of which SDGs were submitted to by which universities. So my starting point, and I've excluded SDG 17 because of course that's the one that is, I wouldn't say compulsory because you don't have to submit it, but if you want to be in the overall ranking, you do. The first thing we can do is look at the overall distribution of the number of universities who submitted to each SDG. And we can see that it's not even. As Mark and Elizabeth have described, it's not surprising that SDG 3 and SDG 4, so that's good health and well-being and quality education, are ones that many universities feel are strong for them. They're areas where they are performing and want to supply data. But we also see a number of universities submitting data around SDG 5 and SDG 16 and SDG 9, to choose but a few. Conversely, we see far fewer universities supplying data around SDG 1, which is no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, SDG 7, which is clean and affordable energy, and then SDGs 14 and 15, life underwater and life on land. Now, there is a little bit of a cause and effect there. We didn't include those SDGs in the first year of the ranking. So it could be either that we made the correct decision that these were SDGs that universities were going to be less likely to be focusing on. Alternatively, it could, of course, simply be that universities would have to start gathering data from scratch again. And so there were fewer participants for that reason. Nevertheless, what I can do, of course, now is use this as a baseline. And this baseline allows me to explore different regions of the world to see if in a particular region universities are more or less likely to submit data than this baseline would suggest. So the first region we'll have a look at is Europe. And in Europe, we see that universities are far more likely to submit data around SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth, and SDG 16, which is, as Mark's just said, peace, justice and strong institutions, than elsewhere in the world. And I hesitate to say this given our recent political history, but those are the founding principles of the Treaty of Rome. That's what the European project really talks to. So it's perhaps no surprise that European universities, and I'm expanding that to include British universities for the time being, would be focused in those particular areas. Conversely, we see significantly less likelihood of universities submitting data around SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, SDGs 1 and SDG 2. I think there's a fairly obvious reason for that. Europe is, compared to much of the rest of the world, a wealthy part of the world. Poverty and hunger are much less of an immediate focus, an immediate issue for people in Europe. Therefore, it is less likely that our universities are going to have a primary focus in those areas. And similarly, SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, where we're in a part of the world where we've taken aspects of that for granted for a very long time. So it is a far less of a focus for our universities. That perhaps isn't surprising. But we can compare this with other parts of the world. If we look at Africa, we see a very different pattern. SDG 1 and SDG 2 are more likely to be submitted to. An interesting one is SDG 5, though, and this is particularly relevant to universities from Arab North Africa. And indeed, if we expanded this and looked at the Middle East as well, we would see universities from the Middle East have a distinct focus around SDG 5, which is gender equality. Universities in that part of the world are clearly seeing themselves as not just being there to reflect local issues, but actually to lead on issues. And in this case, gender equality is clearly one that they see as being a significant challenge to them. Conversely, of course, we see far fewer universities submitting around SDG 12, which is about consumption and production of goods. Finally, then looking at East Asia. So this is an interesting area for us because we're frequently talking about the challenge that East Asian universities are providing in terms of their research work. Now, when we look at the work they're doing towards sustainability, we see a bit of a mixed picture, but again, there we see signs of universities that are really stepping up to the plate and really addressing issues of sustainability. For example, were I to be speaking to a room full of Japanese university presidents, 80% or more of them would be wearing the SDG pin, showing their commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. But what do we see from the data here? Well, it's more mixed than we see in some parts of the world. SDG 1 and SDG 2, this is very much a focus of the universities in Asian countries which are lower income or lower middle income. SDG 6, interestingly, clean water and sanitation, is a particular focus for Indian universities. We see universities from India both presenting a lot of data there, but also scoring very, very strongly. And as we might expect, SDG 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure, is one that we see universities in South Korea, in Japan, but also, interestingly, in Taiwan and China, very keen to submit data on. So we are seeing that there is an element to which universities are genuinely trying to focus their work around the SDGs that seem to be most important within their particular context. And this, I think, is quite healthy, even given the great question we had earlier about does it make sense to submit data to all of the SDGs. I think there's this counterbalancing argument, which is that if you are truly focused in particular areas, perhaps that is the way to go. Now, what I'm going to do now is briefly take the conversation in a different direction. are there things we can learn, or a university could learn about its performance in the SDGs that might be related, or they might be able to relate to the COVID-19 crisis, and very importantly, how they can think about building up impactful relationships with other universities on this basis. I'm now going to undertake perhaps the most frightening thing known to people, which is of course trying to do a live demonstration of software. So here I'm starting within our benchmarking product. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the impact dashboard. And the starting position, this particular screen, is something that all universities that participate in the ranking have access to. It shows the overall position of your university and also the position in each of the SDGs. And in this case, I'm actually looking at this from the perspective of a university in Hong Kong. And so when we first think about COVID-19, we'll probably think of it as being a crisis around health. So the SDG that might be seen as being most relevant would of course be SDG 3, good health and well-being. Although SDG 3 doesn't explicitly mention COVID-19, because of course it was created in 2015, well before we were concerned about this particular illness. It does refer to many of the illnesses that have comorbidities that are associated with a higher incidence of COVID-19. It also speaks about the degree to which universities may be building up the work that they're doing in terms of their broader research, but also their work in the community. So here I can see the performance of this university. And we can see that it's actually quite varied across this SDG. It's doing reasonably in research. It's not doing very strongly in terms of the proportion graduating in health. It's a general purpose university, but it has a very strong score in terms of its collaboration with health services. Now I'm going to go into the part of the tool which is not generally accessible to explore this in more detail. So firstly, I'm using box and whisker plots. Box and whisker plots are a great way of looking at distributions. If we look at the top here, the line in the middle is the median value for the overall score in this SDG. The box represents the middle 50% of universities, and the whiskers obviously the extension to the limits of the score. This university is performing in the second quartile. Its performance is solid but not outstanding. But as we saw earlier, that varies across the different elements. Now the first thing to say, of course, is that actually I don't need to look at the distribution of all universities in the world. I could perhaps look at more specific ones. And in fact, I'm going to compare this university with two mainland Chinese universities, Shantou University and Tongji University. And I'm going to change that distribution to only look at Asian institutions. So the distribution hasn't changed significantly. Asian universities are fairly similar to those in the world as a whole, but now I can see that compared to Asian universities, the performance of this university is a bit stronger. It's in the third quartile. And I can also see how Tongji University and Shantou University are performing. They're outperforming the Hong Kong University in terms of their overall score. And I can expand on the research element and see how the different elements are reflected. So we can see that in terms of paper views, I'm seeing more paper views for the research from the Hong Kong University than I am from the Chinese universities. But in terms of clinical citations, that's when the work that's being done is reflected in clinical guidance. And in terms of the overall publications, the numbers are somewhat different. Now I can explore the data in slightly more detail, and I can see actually that the number of publications from Hong Kong Baptist University is significantly lower than it is from the other two universities, Tongji and Shantou, even though the downloads tell us a very different story. So that's starting to give me some insight. But of course, I have other data that I can rely on to take that further. And if I explore some of that data from the World University Ranking, I can start to see how the performance of the university within clinical and health, SDG 3, compares to the overall research performance. Well, the overall research performance is actually much stronger than it is in clinical and health. with a citation score of 64.2 compared to a citation score just below 40. But let's look at that in terms of subjects, because of course that's the overall score rather than the score within clinical and health. When I look at the clinical and health score, the overall score for Hong Kong Baptist University is 31.6, but again I can drill down slightly further and explore that in terms of its citation score. When I look at the citation score for clinical and health, I see a score that is actually very similar to the citation score within SDG 3. So there seems to be quite a close alignment between the citation score overall in clinical and health and the citation score for SDG 3. It shows, or it suggests to me, that actually there is a strong relationship between the research that I'm doing overall in clinical and the research towards SDG 3. What is concerning though is that the visibility of that research is much lower than I would want. The research reputation is actually standing at 6.7. So that leads me into thinking about this perhaps from a different perspective. Because although clinical and health is perhaps the first way we think about the COVID-19 crisis, it is of course having a huge impact on other aspects, including on the economic environment of our world. And indeed, we've just seen that officially the United Kingdom has gone into recession for the first time since 2008. And of course, universities can be doing research around business and economics as well. If I just switch the view to business and economics, I can see that this university is doing much more strongly in business and economics. Perhaps this is an area where I can think about the relationship with those two Chinese universities as well. There's a nice little view of the subject performance in our reputation tool, which actually looks at the reputation, so the visibility of the research and the citation score on the same diagram. And this really brings into perspective the performance of clinical and health against business and economics for this university, but also this worrying gap between the work, the quality as indicated in the citation score, and the visibility of that work as indicated through the reputation score. And maybe I've got something that we can look at exploring in terms of relationships between the three universities in terms of business and economics alongside clinical and health. And to do that, I'm going to take a quick look at the groupings that we see in that data around reputation. How are universities viewing each other? Where do we see links between universities in terms of the visibility? If I search for Hong Kong Baptist University, in business and economics, I can see that it's in this cluster here, alongside a number of universities, not just Tongji University, which is one of the universities I'm interested in, but also a number of universities from Europe, as well as universities from the US. So this suggests that this is a very international group of universities, so there is some interesting international visibility. And Tongji University already has links into this particular cluster. What about Shantou University, the other university that I was thinking about? Well, Shantou University is in a very different grouping. In fact, it links together with many more Chinese and Taiwanese universities. And this suggests that if I can build out the links with that particular group, that there may be some interesting stories to tell, some ways of developing both the research links and the visibility of the research I'm doing. Of course, we're talking here about the broad aspect of business and economics, but we know that there's also a very important SDG that talks about this. In fact, it's SDG number 8. So let's end up by looking at the performance within SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. And we can see here, firstly, that Hong Kong Baptist is much stronger than it is in in SDG 3, good health and well-being. And I can look for my two Chinese universities, Shantou University and Tongji University, and add these two universities in. And we can see actually that their performance is in the same region as the performance of Hong Kong Baptist University. We can look then for further opportunities where we can cooperate. What are the areas where the performance of Shantou University or Tongji University and Hong Kong Baptist University suggests that there may be opportunities for collaboration and for future research work. So that was a very brief overview of how that data can be used to reflect on research opportunities in this time of COVID-19, how they can potentially suggest new ways of cooperating and working together. But with that, we promised we'd have an opportunity for further questions. Now seems to be a great opportunity to do that. So over to Persephone. Do we have any additional questions?
We do. So there is a question from Miss Karen Johnston. You reference Waterloo on policies for sustainability. However, looking at their website, there is nothing specific labeled as a policy on the website. So in terms of your definition of policy, what do you recognize as a policy?
So policies are really designed to give guidance to the entire organization about a specific issue. So for example, in SDG 5, we look at specific policies around gender pay equity. Now, this is a really important one to talk about because we've often had universities come back to us and said, actually, it's the law in our country that we can't pay women differently to men. Now, it's certainly also been the law in the United Kingdom since, I believe, 1973, when the Pay Equality Act was pushed through by Barbara Castle. However, when we then changed our law a couple of years ago and asked and required institutions, not just universities, it must be said, all companies with more than 200 employees to measure and report on gender pay equity, it turned out that we hadn't done as good a job as we'd hoped. In fact, I think there were only 2 companies in the entire country that could show a positive gender pay equity. So simply having legislation there doesn't guarantee that organisations are able to act effectively on that legislation. So what we're looking for is either a policy or a practice which demonstrates how your university is taking legislation where it's relevant and putting it into practice in the context of your institution. Now, sometimes those policies are public and sometimes they are not public. We believe that policies that are public are actually stronger policies because that enables people to challenge you on them. If you say you have a policy on gender pay equity and people in your community, either internal employees or people externally, don't think you do, they can challenge you and say, well, your policy says you should be doing this. Are you doing it? Demonstrate it to us. So not all policies can be made public. We appreciate that as well. But where they can, we would recommend they are. And again, we're looking for this guidance to the organisation as a whole. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what we're looking for in terms of policies. I would also add, of course, that in the longer term, we would like to get to a stage where all universities have appropriate policies and we can stop asking the question about a policy and start asking that much tougher question about the implementation of the policy and measurement and evaluation of its impact.
One more question from Mr. Adam Riches. Sorry if I didn't pronounce it correctly, but when doing the research scores, is each metric scored in isolation and then consolidated to get the final score? For example, in SDG 2, the relevant metrics are site score, field-weighted citation impact, and number of publications. In this example, if a university had a field-weighted citation impact of 5 high, site score of 100 high, but a volume of 1 publication low, are each scored separately? A high 10% score, a high 10% score, and low 7% score, which equals approximately 20% of the 27th on offer? Or is the field-weighted citation impact or site score normalized further before it is scored due to the small sample size?
Yes, so for metrics such as that, we normalize them before we combine them, because otherwise field-weighted citation impact, which is essentially a ratio of citations compared to an average, wouldn't compare to a percentage, which is what site score is, or a number, which is the volume. So yes, we normalize beforehand. So if you scored highly in 2 and low in the third would pull down the overall score. And this is designed to balance against the situation where you have just a small number of papers, but they're very highly performing. So there is an actual volume element in that. So that does mitigate against smaller institutions or institutions that have smaller departments. This is one of the tensions when we're looking at impact, which is that there is an element of impact which is simply about the volume. That can be both positive, so in the case of publications, or negative in the terms of, for example, carbon dioxide produced. So there is this balance there, and that is the approach we've taken. So again, Adam, thank you for your detailed bibliometric questions.
With regards to the data points system, are we able to see the weighting apportioned to each question for a particular SDG, or is this restricted? Example 27 of SDG 4 was research on early years.
Yes, so in the methodology document, so there is a methodology which is provided on the website, which is designed for more general consumption. But when you go into the data submission portal, there is a very detailed methodology. And within that, we go through and we explain the exact proportions and the point scoring system in extensive detail. Now, that's designed to be much fuller than the methodologies we've produced for public consumption in the past. We hope you'll find it useful. We're also committed to publishing this year's methodology, so the 2021 methodology, in August, in advance of the portal opening. So this is before the data submission process starts. We hope that that will be seen as a positive step forward. Now, there may within 2021 be changes made to that methodology. We hope there won't be, but for example, if we found out that on data submission, the data that was coming back from a particular data element was unreliable, then we reserve the right to make that change later in the day, but we hope we won't have to do that. We hope that the methodology, as published in August, will be the final methodology for this year. So we fully welcome everyone having a look at that. Also, if you see stuff in that and it isn't clear from the methodology, please again do talk to us and we will try and iterate that and make it clearer and more relevant. But we hope that it will be a significant step forward. It's currently running at about 140 pages, so it is very, very detailed.
And I think that this was actually a last question.
Okay, well...
Oh, there is one more.
Oh, excellent.
Submitted. So it is from Miss Sarah, and it is whether university is acknowledged as a partner under SDG 17 on another university's submittal. Is there any impact on that university's own rankings? Sorry,
could you repeat the question? I'm not entirely certain, unless Elizabeth or Mark can jump in. I didn't quite get the intention of the question.
So where a university is acknowledged as a partner under SDG number 17 on another university's submittal, is there any impact on that university's own rankings?
No, there isn't. So that would be an interesting situation where someone gave as evidence working with a particular university, but the other university didn't do it the other way around. Now, why might that be the case? Well, one of the things we're trying to do in SDG 17, and there one of the research metrics is very different, by the way. It's looking at cooperation between your university and universities in lower and lower income and lower middle income countries. You could see that that balance. If you're coming from, for example, the United Kingdom, which is a high income country, despite what our government's trying to do, it's still a high income country. If we looked at a relationship with a university in, say, Tanzania, that would be an example of work with a university in a lower and lower middle income country, but the reverse, of course, wouldn't be the case. So there may be imbalances there. It wouldn't have a direct impact, but it still would be a good example of partnership.
Perfect. And I believe that this is our last question.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for participating in the session today. I hope you've gained an insight into the impact ranking methodology. I would say, obviously we don't believe that it's a perfect methodology, but we do hope that it is at least taking steps to being as equitable as possible and, importantly, to shine a light on a type of work, a type of activity that universities have been doing for many, many years, but for which they haven't always been getting appropriate credit. Mark and Elizabeth took us through some of the results with a focus on Europe, and hopefully that was useful. And then finally, I had a look at how we could perhaps explore the data in a more dynamic way, particularly taking into account the changing nature of the world we're in. The recording and the material will be made available to everyone who's attended. Please do contact Nicholas Kletz for access to that. And indeed, any further questions you have, you can either send them through to Nicholas or indeed to the more general Impact email address, which is impact@timeshighereducation.com. We're very committed to this ranking, not just as a ranking, but actually as a mechanism for supporting universities in their goal to becoming much more focused on sustainability and specifically the Sustainable Development Goals. So thank you once more for your participation from myself and the rest of the team here at Times Higher Education.